It's a beautiful day, and I am delighted to welcome you to a new episode of the Computational Antitrust Podcast. My name is Thibaut Schrepel. I am a faculty affiliate at Stanford University Codex Center, an associate professor of law at the VU Amsterdam, and the creator of the Computational Antitrust Project, which explores how legal informatics can benefit antitrust law. The project brings together over 65 competition agencies and about 50 academics on the advisory board. Every month or so, we publish an academic article on computational antitrust. You can find these publications at computationalantitrust.com. Today, I am delighted to receive Wohak, a teaching and research associate at the Vienna University of Economics and Business. Together with Klaus Gogler and Florian Such, he wrote a paper for us entitled Using Natural Language Processing to Delineate Digital Markets. So, Ulrich, very nice to have you. Welcome to the podcast. What I thought we'll be doing is to divide the conversation in two distinct parts. In part one, I want to talk about the methods that you deployed because it is very original, and I trust that it will be very helpful to competition agencies listening to us, but also people within law firms and economic consultancies. And then in part two, I want to talk about the results, so what you did find using that innovative methodology, and then maybe take a step back and discuss subjects that do not appear in the paper as such, but that will be derivative from your paper. But before that, please explain your key findings in about 2 minutes in case we have a listener in a rush.
Okay, sure. Before I jump to the results, let me sort of give you a very short background of the research question. So we were interested in assessing effects of mergers, specifically in technology markets, and what happens to sort of venture capital investment and innovation in a broader sense after a large technology company acquires a young startup. Now, to do this, we need to define a set of firms that could potentially be affected. In antitrust analysis, we typically think of this set of firms that have some sort of competitive relationship with the acquired firm. Now, sort of the conventional way to do this in antitrust analysis is to think in terms of market definition. And in order to define markets, one of the central ideas is to use the SNP test. So which uses as input market level data, usually, or firm level data, which is either prices or quantities, that are then very informative about the competitive relationships between the firms in a potential market. Now, the issue that we faced is that the acquisitions that we were looking at were technology acquisitions, and very often these acquired firms were very young startup firms. And as most people familiar with antitrust analysis know, is that for such firms, first of all, these products are often at a price of zero. So this is already makes conventional analysis very difficult. And then on top of that, these sort of nascent firms is a very dynamic environment. So it's very difficult to capture all of these. This was sort of the problem number one. And the problem number two we had is that we are interested in analyzing a large number of acquisitions. So we needed something that we can scale up a lot. Now, what we were looking for is something that is not there. So we had to be a little more creative and use something that is not very common in antitrust analysis. So the data we were looking at is text data, and in particular, we were using the business description of these young startups to infer competitive conditions in a particular market. Now, the paper that we published in the Stanford Journal is sort of an assessment of how these methods using text data, so natural language processing techniques, can be used by different stakeholders in the antitrust realm. And we are assessing, first of all, how useful they are, and second of all, how sensitive they are. And now, if I may come to the results, is what we find is that our proposed method is very useful in the sense that we find a lot of competitors that are indeed actual competitors. And we do this by comparing the set of competitors that we identify with a set of competitors that was identified by expert analysts, so by the European Commission. We do find on average about 50% of competitors that the European Commission identifies. This is a number that we will talk about much more, I think, a little bit later. But what we also find is we identify a number of rivals that the European Commission does not find. And this is, I think, one of the strongest suits of our approach, is that we can sort of scale up this identification of potential competitors to basically millions and millions of firms and distill down which firms are relevant. And in that sense, we find that the methods that we propose by using text data in order to find relevant competitors is a very useful complementary tool to classic antitrust analysis.
Yeah, so it's a very good teaser, almost like a trailer, right? Because you talked about the methodology and some of the results, and we're going to unpack all that. So starting with the methodology, and this will be part one of the discussion, please explain that methodology that you used in the paper and how it works, knowing that most of the people listening to us have no technical expertise, but I do see a very strong desire to learn from those tools. So you will be facing a crowd here that is willing to listen to what you have to say. So please go ahead.
Okay. So maybe before jumping into the method right away, what is sort of the underlying hypothesis is that when using text data, is that the text is informative about what the company is doing. So we were using business descriptions that describe the products and services that firms are using. And what is sort of underlying in the whole analysis is that if a firm has, let's take two firms, if firm A and firm B have a very similar business description, we think that they are producing very similar services and very similar products. Subsequently, we would imagine that these firms are sort of a competitive constraint on each other. So this is sort of the underlying hypothesis that across the whole paper, basically. Now, I think this is not something that is super alien. We think that firms that are producing similar products and similar services are typically a competitive constraint on one another. And we sort of infer not only the binary decision whether or not they are competitive constraints on each other, we also infer the intensity of this competitive constraint on the firms. Now, I'm not sure how much technical detail is relevant for the listeners, but maybe let me just start and Thibaut interrupt me if I'm going too far or if I don't give enough information. So I'm an economist by training, so I'll try to describe the data so that listeners can understand what I'm talking about. So what we have is a data set of firms. So you can think of a data set, think of an Excel sheet, basically, where each row is a particular firm. We have the firm name, we have firm ID. So we can distinguish between different firms, and we also have the business description. Now, what we do is we prepare the data such that a computer can analyze it. Computers do not understand language, which with the whole ChatGPT thing might sound surprising to some, but really what it comes down to is we want to translate the text into numbers, because with numbers we can do a lot of fancy mathematics that helps us understand the competitive conditions in the market. Now, how this works is that we take this data set that I just described, and we basically create what is called a bag of words representation. So in a sense, we basically just count how often a particular word appears in a particular business description. And then we can sort of the simplest way of using this bag of words representation is to simply count the co-occurrence of words. So if the word, I'm not sure if the word, let's think of something halfway reasonable. If the word apple appears 15 times in firm A's and firm B's business description, we would tend to think that these firms are in the business of selling apples or something related.
Or digital products such as iPhone, right?
Exactly, indeed. So if the word operating system occurs in firm A's and firm B's business description, we would think that these firms are engaged in something related to operating systems. Now, this is a very simple way of dealing with text data, and it has a lot of deficiencies. So Well, this is something that is very particular to language, is that language is not as maybe concise as numbers, one could argue. I'm sure this is a slightly controversial statement. But we need to find a way to account for example, words that have multiple meanings, and conversely for a lot of words that have the same meaning. And to do this, we employ a machine learning algorithm. This particular one that we used is called latent semantic indexing. And we sort of feed into this latent semantic indexing model this bag of words representation. So we represent our business descriptions in a numerical matrix, where in each row we have the business description of a particular firm, and in each column you can think of each column as representing a particular word. And then we simply have a numeric entry, how often a word appears in a particular business description. What we do in an intermediate step is that we want to reduce the noise in our data. So if you think of your normal human language, let me call it like that, there's a lot of words that do not carry a lot of meaning. So for example, the words and, the, and so forth, they are not very useful in distinguishing between different business activities. So we get rid of all of these words. And even after getting rid of all these words, there might still be a couple of words left that appear very frequently across different business descriptions, or very often in one singular business description. And those words are sort of similar in the sense that they are not particularly informative in distinguishing between different business activities. So what we do is sort of the technical language is that we do a term frequency inverse document frequency reweighting of this matrix that I just described. And this matrix is then fed into our latent semantic indexing algorithm. Now, this algorithm is in fact not that novel. I think the novel part is that we are applying it to antitrust analysis. But I think it's an algorithm from the 70s or 80s. It just works very well for our application. This is ultimately why we went for this particular algorithm. And what it does, sort of also mathematically, for the mathematically inclined, is not a super complicated thing. We're just applying what is called a singular value decomposition to this numeric matrix that represents our set of business descriptions. And what this does, in a sense, if I try a non-technical explanation, is that it distills down this huge, big matrix of word counts across documents into a smaller set of manageable pieces of information. Maybe is a good way to say it. And from this singular value decomposition, we can learn about the similarity of documents beyond what is possible with a simpler word count. Because this singular value decomposition, in essence, what it does, it takes the context of the word or the surroundings of a particular word into account and infers the meaning from the context of a particular word. So we're able to achieve something much more powerful than is possible with a simpler word comparison. And then with this, we look at the acquired firms and try and use this output to infer which firms are engaging in a similar business activity. And this allows us then to sort of maybe do a mapping of the competitive constraints or the competitive landscape around an acquired firm.
So in a sense, your approach accounts for ambiguities in business descriptions such as polysemy, synonymy, which obviously we will then discuss the limits, but it's one big limit that you can avoid, right? In a sense. Now, another one, and I think this is on top probably of most of our listeners' mind right now, is that you used Crunchbase business description, which is a database freely available. I mean, not freely available, but available if you are willing to pay, where you can access those business descriptions for startups and digital companies. But how would you approach deployment of your NLP-based market delineation to other types of markets? You talked about Apple and fruits and vegetables. If you wanted to deploy the same for those companies, where would you go? Would it be even possible to find their business description somewhere? Or would it be just not possible because, well, the data is not even there up for a grab?
Yeah, so this is something I would say is a little bit case specific. So maybe let me do a small shout out to Crunchbase, because Crunchbase data is available for free for researchers. So
Didn't know
if
that.
anybody ever wants to engage in an academic project, the Crunchbase support team is very supportive, and they do give you access to their API.
Yeah, you can also create accounts and I give you 7 days free access, which is what I've done several
Exactly,
times, but it's not
exactly.
as convenient as getting an access with a university email address. But please go ahead.
Yeah, so coming back to your original question, so I suppose this is a nice feature of our approach, is that it's really not specific to digital markets. The only thing you need is text data, and then you can run everything you want. In fact, we computed these sort of application of our algorithm for the whole set of firms in the Crunchbase database, and the Crunchbase database is not limited to digital firms. In fact, there is a rather famous Hoburg and Phillips study from 2016 that uses the universe of 10K files, which are files that every publicly listed company in the US has to file yearly. And there's a mandatory section called business description, and they used this to sort of map the competitive conditions across all of these publicly listed firms. Now, some viewers might be wondering why we were not using these 10K files. And the reason for this is simply that these 10K files are only available for publicly listed firms. And we were specifically interested in young nascent startups. And this is what Crunchbase specializes in, is in joint venture, in venture capital investment, which is often given to very young nascent startups. So this is why we use the Crunchbase data. And exactly, but this is not limited to digital markets. Really, this is anything text related, where you're interested in the similarity between different pieces of text. Our approach works very well. There's also a lot of other approaches out there, but this is definitely something that is much wider in scope than we are presenting in the paper.
So, all right. So Crunchbase, maybe the 10Ks or other data sets will be there, and so it means that your methodology can actually be deployed not just in the digital economy, but over the pretty much the broad spectrum of economic activities. So now this brings the question: should a competition agency listening to us right now be interested in deploying this methodology, or shall we say a law firm or an economy consultancy? How long would it take for them to deploy it if they have the data? And what are the costs involved?
So it's an interesting question, because my journey with working with text data started when I was working as an economist at the Competition and Markets Authority for the UK, for the British Competition Authority, precisely because they were interested in using text data to help, to sort of aid in the analysis. In fact, what I did for the CMAs was sort of motivated by a different application. As most antitrust practitioners know, is that in a lot of cases, the parties or stakeholders submit a large number of documents, and it is very costly for antitrust practitioners to sift through all these documents and identify the one or two relevant sentences that one might be looking for. And this was my first application, is that I wanted to develop a sort of an analytical pipeline to look through documents submitted by parties to identify potentially possible relevant documents and maybe even relevant text passages in those documents. So I do think there is a lot of scope for competition agencies and other stakeholders in the antitrust realm.
Let me ask you a question. Sorry to interrupt
Sure.
you. Were you working with the digital unit, or were you an economist hired as an economist within the CMA?
The digital unit was established, I think, half a year after I left. After I left the CMA, and they took they are still working with the project that I started.
Okay.
As far as I'm aware.
One other question then: how come you have this expertise? Because not all economists can actually deploy something similar. So where did you learn about all that?
So I basically I'm a self-taught text programmer, or working with text models is something that I think, and this I think also goes back to your original question with respect to the costs involved, is that this is something that if you have an analytic or mathematical background, is something that you can teach with free, you can learn with free resources online. So while I think there are costs involved, so one is surely the learning cost for the practitioners, and maybe the other is to set up the analytical pipeline for these kinds of models. But once this cost is paid, what is very nice is that it's very scalable. So having it set up one time, it's very easy to update for additional years, for additional data on the one hand. And on the other hand, you get a complete mapping of so you get a complete mapping of the competitive conditions within the sample that you feed into the algorithm. So if you think of this example with the 10K files from this Holberg and Phillips paper from 2016, there was a lot of work involved, but the output is a complete mapping of the competitive conditions of all publicly listed firms in the US. And this is obviously something that is very valuable, not only for competition agencies, but also for consultancies, also for law firms. So I think the costs involved are far, far lower than the benefits generated from such an approach.
As you said as well, because it is scalable and can be automated quite easily once implemented, what one could imagine is that a competition agency will have a deal with a company in possession of all of this data, let's say Crunchbase, and then will automatically update the analysis as in a way to flag in which markets do you see more or less, what are the trends, and where you see more or less companies coming in, leaving the market, which will give you not just a picture of what's happening and how many competitors in July 2024, but over time, how a market is evolving. That would be a nice output.
Yes, indeed. I think so. What we look at in the paper is sort of we're assessing the sensitivity of our approach, and we have an application to merger cases, but the applications are much wider in scope in terms of the functions of a competition agency, for example. So if one imagines sort of the ideal state that you just described, you can have a live mapping, you can observe live what is happening in the economy. Clearly, this is not something that is super easy to do, but this is something that is theoretically feasible. And this is not only helpful for assessing merger cases. This is very interesting for market studies, but this is also very interesting, for example, for identifying markets where there might be an issue. So it could be sort of an upstream input into the market study pipeline is where should competition agencies look. So this is something I think that spans the whole spectrum, or the usefulness spans the whole spectrum of the competition agencies' remit, indeed.
Yeah, and it may enable agencies to understand market as ecologies as opposed to, something that is very static. All right, let's move on to part 2 of our discussion, where we discuss even more of the results and then try to go beyond. Your paper presents, at least in my view, 2 main findings. Number 1, you find narrower relevant markets than the European Commission, or at least less competitors than what the European Commission may find in given markets. And 2, some of the competitors that you identify are not identified by the European Commission. So the question is this: at this stage, does your methodology have the potential to, quote unquote, only expedite the market definition process? And then, you then put 1 or 2 case handlers and complement the analysis? Or do you think that it could also complement existing relevant market definition? So in a sense, how do you see that being used by competition agencies?
Indeed, I think it can do both, yet it is not a substitute for careful consideration of competition practitioners. So maybe go through the question one by one. So it can definitely expedite the first image a practitioner might get before even receiving data from the parties or any other third-party stakeholder. Because as we described before, you could have sort of an ongoing competitive mapping of the economy. Or maybe the economy is a bit too much, is the sample that you use. Let's keep it concise. So imagine there's a new merger rolling into the shop at a particular competition authority. You can immediately see what does the competitive landscape around this firm look like. So in that sense, it expedites the process for sure. And it can complement in the sense, and this I think goes back to the 2 points you made in the sense that we do not find all the competitors that the European Commission finds, but we find a lot of competitors that the European Commission did not find. Now, maybe to put sort of a small warning around it, is that we do not know whether the European Commission even considered the competitors that we found that the European Commission did not find. So, but I suppose this is another strength, is that our consideration set for a particular candidate market is the whole sample. So we are able to look through millions and millions of firms that could be potential competitors. Clearly, this is not possible with human effort alone. But markets are complex, right? And things are typically not very straightforward. And using business descriptions is something that sometimes works well, sometimes does not work very well. So I think sort of to answer your question is, yes, it can expedite the markets. Yes, it is complementary, but it is not a substitute.
Okay, let's see if we can do even more with it. And this is where we take a step back. As you know, competition scholars have been actively debating the relevance of defining relevant markets. And this is notably highlighted by Lewis Kaplow's influential paper, Why Ever Define Market. So please explain how your findings contribute to or impact this ongoing debate. Is it that because we can deploy your methodology, there is actually a role for defining relevant markets and we could do it in a way that is a bit more systematic? Or would you say that it has actually no impact on this much broader picture debate?
So I would say that what we are trying to do in the paper is a very narrow thing that is not going to impact this broader debate, but I'll put it into context a little bit. Because again, what we're trying to understand is if this method is useful within the context of traditional antitrust analysis. So we're not making any statements or any claims about whether market definition per se is something that is useful or not useful. We are only looking at whether what we are doing, working with text data, using machine learning algorithms, is helpful for defining traditional antitrust markets. Now, going maybe back to the Kaplow paper, clearly there is an argument to be made, and I think most practitioners are typically very tired at the end of a case when they think about market definition, because this occupies a lot of time and often is not something that is very useful. So I think within this debate, whether or not one is a fan of the traditional market definition approach, is that what our method yields is a set of potential competitive constraints. So this could then be an input into what happens after market definition. So we can still understand, are there many firms that are a competitive constraint on maybe two firms or one firm acquiring the other? Is there very strong competition going on in a particular market or not? What we can also see, and this is depends a little bit on the underlying data that you're feeding into the algorithm, is that we can also understand the dynamics very well. And this is something that often in market definition is a rather static concept with some questionable comparative statics, if one wants to put it that way. But the power of our approach is that we will better understand the competitive landscape. We are able to understand entry and exit at the very bottom of the ladder, in the sense that we are able, because it's so scalable, we can take into account the startups as well, and we can sort of trace what's happening with them and the competitive conditions over time. So the sober answer is no. I don't think our paper contributes to this much broader debate because it is a very targeted application. But it is useful whether one believes in conventional market definition or not.
And I suppose that given the trend that we've seen and witnessed in recent years, where you see that the European Commission is saying, well, you are dominant over yourself, pretty much, right? So if you are Google, you dominate Android. If you're Apple, you dominate the iOS. It could be that in-house counsels and lawyers may want to deploy this approach, not necessarily for the sake of arguing it before the European Commission and national competition agencies, but just to know if it is even worth spending time on, fighting for the relevant market. If you do see that there are 15 competitors, well, this may be something you want to push as a lawyer. If you do find one or two, you're going to be fine to be dominant over yourself. So why even bother?
Indeed, I think this can be a good starting point, but I do not want to overstate the robustness of what we're doing. This is something that, if you imagine being in front of a court, is not something that I would say is sort of a hard piece of evidence. I think this, again, is complementary to what stakeholders are already doing. It is a very cheap way of understanding things quickly, but it is not a something that a singular piece of evidence that one should base any decision on.
Let me ask a final question. We talked about ecologies, and you've mentioned the fact that markets are complex. That makes me think of the tendency that we see already emerging, where competition agencies are increasingly interested in defining ecosystems, right? And maybe move beyond this idea of markets isolated from one another. How might your methodology assist in defining ecosystem?
Indeed, this is always a tricky one because every ecosystem is very different. As far as I understand, there's also no generally agreed upon definition of what an ecosystem is. So I'll try to give an answer. I think there are definitely cases where this approach can be useful. It clearly depends on so what is the connecting links in the ecosystem. So if you think of, so there's cases where, for example, the ecosystem is held together purely by technical specifications. So this might be something that is not necessarily related to the downstream products that are sold by the firms within the ecosystem. And if this is not reflected in the text data, then there is no chance that such an algorithm could ever find this. So I suppose when one thinks about using text data to sort of gauge whether there is any merit to an ecosystem theory of harm, I think the most important thing is to understand whether the text data that you're working with reflects the dynamics and the sort of the definitional aspects of the ecosystem. If that is the case, then I do believe there is a good chance that something useful turns out, that any text algorithm outputs something useful. But clearly, there are many cases where this is not possible. So really, it's always super important to understand whether the text data you are working with is representing what you're interested in. And I think this has to be assessed on a case-by-case basis.
What about creating clusters of companies that may compete, markets, and if you see that the business description of two companies that are not within the same clusters actually overlap, this may show that there is, kind of two clusters overlapping, therefore an ecosystem. Would it be something that is feasible?
Yes, I mean, I think even more than this, I would say, because so when you speak about clusters, this already entails a discretionary decision by the practitioner or the researcher or whoever might be tasked with doing this. Because eventually, what the output of such algorithms is a matrix of similarity scores. So for every firm pair in your sample, what you can look at is the similarity of this firm pair. So in a sense, you can think of this as a continuous network. And then defining a cluster would entail making a particular decision about the similarity score cutoff, is what we call it in the paper. So we say that firms are in a particular cluster if the similarity score is above 0.3, for example. So this is a discretionary decision. We also stress this in the paper that this is not sort of an analytic result or an equilibrium condition. This is something that the practitioner has to choose for themselves. Now, but to come back to your question, I think we can understand not only this discretionary cluster definition, but also we can see the continuous movement of singular firms within the network. So I think there's a lot of scope to better understand not only the static picture of the competitive landscape, but also in sort of over time how this competitive landscape moves and where new clusters maybe appear. And if some clusters sort of completely dissolve. So I think there's a lot of room for more work. Indeed, for me, it is, but also for practitioners to learn from such models.
Yeah, and the time factor is poorly understood in competition law. So this is a big contribution. All right, let me ask a bonus question. After someone has deployed your methodology to better understand market and ecosystem, and it's getting tired, please give us one movie and one album that someone should watch and listen to.
Okay, so with the movie, maybe I'll go with Memento.
Wow, you want us to be depressed?
It's a great movie, though.
Okay, no spoiler. It's a great movie.
And for the album, I mean, there's many great ones, but maybe give System of a Down, Toxicity a go.
Okay, so some more energy after watching Memento, maybe.
Sure.
All right. Well, on that, thank you very much. It's a great paper. Very happy that we were able to work with you on that and to put it out there. Thank you for the great conversation. Again, the article is available on our website, computationalantitrust.com. You do have a personal website with more ongoing research projects, so also have a look at that. And in the meantime, to everyone out there, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.